for me to introduce to you Donna May, who was one of the founding members of MumsDU. And I'm going to leave it to Donna to both explain a little bit about the important work that MumsDU does, and in so doing, then introduce Jordan Westfall. Donna.
Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome back from lunch, and it was delicious. Thank you very much to our catering team for providing it for us. It was great variety and very nutritious. Thank you. In this arena, I'm best known as being one of the founders and the director of an organization that I began because of the death of my daughter. I didn't have anywhere to turn, and I found that many family members, many mothers, many fathers, also found themselves in the same position, and we were in need of somewhere to go to find information. So MumsDU stands for Mums United and mandated to saving the lives of drug users. And I wish an organization had been in place when I was about to lose my daughter, so that I could have had the benefit of the members of MumsDU to fall on when I was suffering from the loss. But before all that happened to me, I was just a mum. That privilege was stolen from me due to my own ignorance and society's ignorance around substance use. And I didn't realize that substance use was just a way to feel good. I thought it was a willful behavior and a wrong behavior. And through my experiences in the last 5 years after losing my daughter, I've learned that it's something much different. It's just a means to feel better, to relieve some types of anxiety or mental illnesses. And my mandate working with parents today is to make sure that they understand the same things. And that's one of my reasons for traveling to attend functions like this, is to learn as much as I can so I can bring it back and share it with my community of members who are either struggling with substance use with their children or who have lost a child, so that they can better understand what change in policy could and should mean for them in order to protect other lives. And I'm just one mom who lost my child to substance use, and I used to be a minority. And sadly, that's not true anymore. I'm receiving calls on a daily basis, and sometimes up to 6 calls a day from newly bereaved parents, or parents who are just at their wits' end not knowing where to turn. It's a sad reality that our drug policy has failed us. And not only have we as parents each suffered immeasurable losses, but society has lost an entire generation of potential. I can't tell you what it feels like to receive those phone calls and to recognize that, again, that day, we've lost another life or many lives. And that potential is now gone. You know, our future has now changed. I was out last night having drinks with some of the people that are in this room who helped organize this event, and I was standing there staring at my glass of wine and looking at it and going, I'm so fortunate to be able to stand here and drink this glass of wine, not have to worry about it being contaminated. Because my foregoers took a look at the policy that was in place, and they realized how deadly it was, and they made changes. They stopped prohibition. They saved my life, because I might have chosen to drink that glass of wine even though it was contaminated or poisoned. And if we've already had that example, If we already know what prohibition does, why are we still doing it? Why are we doing that today? To me, it's nothing short of murder. And that's what our policies and our policy makers have to realize. I'd like to introduce you now to somebody I have the utmost respect for. He has taken something that was not only important to him, but he's made it essential to all of those who use drugs. And he's made it his mandate to see that all people are recognized for their worth and not simply identified as some substance users. Jordan Westfall is the current president of the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs, or CAPUD. As president of that organization, Jordan oversaw a rapid expansion of the group's membership and scope of his advocacy work. This includes increasing CAPUD's social media presence, which I borrow from constantly. Thank you, Jordan. He's the voice of health promotion and policy communication, and he is part of their participation in policy development. Campaigns that CAPUD has developed include the Ban the Body campaign to eliminate stigmatizing imagery in health communications. We've all seen those posters of the person dead on the street or being revived by naloxone, and it's not right. It's dehumanizing. CAPUD was also the co-intervener in the Regina versus Lloyd Supreme Court case that saw mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses struck down as unconstitutional. So the work of CAPUD is far-reaching and is impacting all of us on a substantial basis. Jordan has his master's degree, and I'm very proud of that, Jordan. From the Simon Fraser University. He wrote his graduate thesis on drug overdose prevention in British Columbia. His writing has been published in the Vancouver Sun and the Globe and Mail, and I expect much, much more to be coming his way, from him, our way, very soon. Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks, Donna. We are at a time in our history when drug overdose is a leading cause of accidental death. When we talk about a better future here today, we have to make overdose epidemics killing Canadians every single day a thing of our past. Each death is needless. We're losing an entire generation, an endless amount of potential for drug war that turns citizens into criminals. Turning the trauma of today into history does not mean simply restricting the supply of available prescription drugs. The more the supply is restricted, the more people resort to buying unpredictable street drugs. More people die. Our government reacts by restricting these drugs even more, and things spiral out of control. Government comes to the conclusion that the drugs have to go, but by proxy, people are eliminated too. Every 6 hours in BC, someone dies. Ontario and Alberta fare a little better as overdose deaths continue to skyrocket. The deaths that we experience every day are being called the new normal, meaning that the increasing numbers of people dying in Canada will continue unabated. This does not have to be the new normal. Again, there is no reason that so many people have to die. Before we look to the future, we have to learn a lesson from history. During the era of alcohol prohibition in the 1920s and the 1930s, the United States averaged 1,000 deaths per year from people drinking alcohol contaminated with ether, acetone, and other deadly chemicals. Nowadays, in 2017, Canada loses thousands more to drug overdose, and fentanyl sold as heroin is becoming increasingly responsible. History teaches us that prohibition failed in the 20th century, and it is once again failing us in the 21st century. Alcohol prohibition ended in the United States in 1933, and the deaths of liquor consumers stopped happening. While different in context and circumstances, the overdose epidemic we face now can be remedied in much the same way. This does not have to be the new normal. Back in the 1920s, Canada became a haven for bootleggers smuggling alcohol across the border into the United States. In theory, this is called the balloon effect. The successive eradication in one area temporarily reduces the supply of a substance, and that translates into a price rise. Higher prices stimulate people to plant crops in other places. So basically, where there's a demand for drugs, someone will supply. When the prescription drug OxyContin was reformulated in the United States, Americans near the Canadian border crossed over to Canada to get their prescriptions filled. And when Canada reformulated the drug and introduced a new drug called OxyNeo that was supposed to be more difficult to inject or sniff, street prices for the original OxyContin skyrocketed, while OxyNeos could be bought for far cheaper than the original drug. OxyContin's elimination brought us more problems and more misery. It brought heart valve infections to the people injecting OxyNeo. It brought an influx of heroin and bootleg fentanyl to small-town Ontario. This does not have to be the new normal. In a conversation I had recently with a 64-year-old family member, I realized that I knew more people who have died in the last year than they have. I'm 29 years old, and things have gotten so drastic that friends I know growing up are being outlived by their parents and grandparents. Every time I open Facebook, I brace myself for another memorial. When I look back, I'm haunted by the losses of some amazing people who changed the field I work in for the better. Friends working in factories and assembly lines knocked down by chronic pain using drugs to keep them productive members of society. Government sees the drugs we take as the problem. It's an easy scapegoat. But look at the socioeconomic context of Ontario throughout the last decade. 400,000 manufacturing jobs lost. An aging workforce with limited retraining potential and opportunity. People using drugs to cope and just to continue working. When we lose the context and blame the drug itself, we ignore the societal problems that contribute to people's drug use. We have to stop making drug policy in a vacuum. When government removes a drug without the consent of the people using it, we're basically using public policy as a blunt force weapon and expect people to pick up the pieces. They become criminalized. Criminals become overdose victims, and overdose victims crowd morgues. These victims are still stigmatized even after death. Funeral homes carrying naloxone under a misguided fear that they may contract death from those already deceased. Families deny your cause of death, overwhelmed by shame. This is also starkly reminiscent of the stigma and discrimination that accompanied the HIV epidemic in the 1980s. Moving forward, this horror has to be a transitional period in our drug policy. In a very, very small way, supervised consumption sites start this conversation. Under Canadian law, drug possession is decriminalized within a supervised consumption site. Supervised consumption sites exist as a neutral zone in a war on drugs, and no one using the service ever dies. Canada is making other policy shifts in this direction. We see the Good Samaritan Bill, which decriminalizes drug possession at the scene of an overdose. We are doing this again because it saves lives. These are tiny, incremental steps, but what's needed is nothing short of an entire reassessment of our drug policy and the human rights of people who use drugs. Nowadays, people can take a sip of beer and never worry that it might kill them suddenly. Why can't we all have that safety? Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.
I think some of them at least like what you had to say quite a bit. That was good.
Yes,
that was good.
Yes.
You've agreed to take a couple of questions,
Yeah.
and I'm going to ask Jen Pierce if she can grab one of the wandering mics just behind her, and you can stay right here at the podium.
Okay.
But any questions? I mean, there was a great set of remarks. Yeah, we've got one right over here, and just if you could, as a courtesy, just say who you are and if you're with an organization, and then direct your question.
Hi, so my name is Chanel Twan, and I also am a board member for the Canadian Association of Used Drugs for the province of Alberta. My question is, back on February 21st, Kaput hosted a kind of a national event with a day of action. Could you just maybe reiterate to us maybe some of the federal demands that were asked upon that day?
Absolutely. So we had 5 federal demands, the first of which was in the short term, in the very short term, decriminalizing possession of all drugs. In the long term, the goal is to move towards legalization and regulation of all drugs. We also demanded immediate exemptions for all proposed supervised consumption sites across the country. We demanded that Health Canada give heroin or diacetylmorphine a drug identification number, which would sort of prepare it to be able to be, produced in Canada. So to give people access to a very safe supply of drugs. We also demanded that our prisons, people who are in prison have access to harm reduction supplies, including needle exchanges and opioid substitution therapy. And lastly, we asked for funding support to help us get our voices out, because user unions are so underrepresented in the policy discourse still, and that really needs to change.
Other questions? Got a comment. All right.
I just want to, it's not a question, it's just a comment for Jordan, that you represent it's obviously what most of us here know, believe, and must work towards, so just thanks, you're awesome.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, then we'll get back to it. But
Cool.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
And throughout the whole conference.
Yeah, thanks.
So with that, we're going to now move into our next set of 2 plenary sessions, which means we've got another exciting lineup of speakers to introduce them. I've got both Donald McPherson and Claudia Stoicescu, who are going to join me up here. Donald, of course, is known to many of you as the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Drug Policy. And Claudia, one of the Trudeau scholars who's completing her DPhil at the University of Oxford in social interventions. So I'll leave it to you to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Peter. The theme of this afternoon's panel discussion is decriminalization and regulation. And over the past few days, the conversation around cannabis regulation in Canada has taken on new life with the Liberal government's recent announcement that cannabis will become legal by July 1st, 2018. So this afternoon, we invite our speakers and yourselves to broaden and nuance that conversation beyond cannabis to other controlled drugs, and to explore the feasibility, opportunities, and challenges of a reality where drug use and possession are decriminalized and regulated. Should Canada pursue such alternatives? What implementation challenges can be expected, and how can these be mitigated? How do we determine appropriate models of control for different types of drugs in Canada? And how do we learn from global best practice to do so? So we have 4 wonderful panelists to explore those questions this afternoon, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak. So first we have Anne Fordham. Anne Fordham, come on up. She directs the work of the International Drug Policy Consortium, leading on the coordination and development of the network. Anne was appointed as Executive Director in 2011. She originally joined IDPC in 2008 as the first coordinator of the network, and in that time has grown the network from 32 to more than 140 organizations worldwide. Anne is the chair of the Strategic Advisory Group to the United Nations on Drug Use and HIV, and is regularly invited to comment on drug policy, global drug policy issues in the media. Welcome, Anne. Our second speaker is Dr. Manuel Cardoso, who's Deputy General Director of the General Directorate for Intervention on Addictive Behaviors and Dependencies in Portugal. Welcome, Mr. Cardoso. We have Dr. Mark Ware, then, who is Vice President at the Development Services Group. Dr. Ware practices pain medicine at the Montreal General Hospital and Montreal Neurological Institute. He teaches clinical pain management, including pharmacology, complementary approaches to chronic pain, and the neurobiology of pain. He's also Executive Director of the nonprofit Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids. Welcome. And finally, we have Dr. Mark Kleiman, who is an American professor, author, and blogger who deals with issues of drug and criminal justice policy. In 2015, Dr. Kleiman became the director of the Crime and Justice Program at NYU's Marin Institute of Urban Management. He's an expert in the field of crime and drug policy and is the author of several books in the field. He's also the chairman of Botech Analysis Corporation, a consultancy that focuses on crime, drug policy, and urban development. And just before we have our first speaker up, I'm just going to give it over to Donald. I know your name. I blanked for a second.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm just so delighted this panel is happening because it is lurking beneath the surface of so many discussions. We tried to have a discussion about border control, and near the end of the session we got into a good dust-up over regulation and the different kinds of, I think with Mark and Kasia and I and a couple of other people were going at it right into the break, and where we started to make some progress when no one else was in the room. So anyways, and you've heard it bubbling up under the surface from Jordan, I mean, we're at a point in history where there's a momentum for exploring new approaches, if you want to put it in as benign a language as possible, is palpable, and we need to do that. And what it looks like in the end, who knows? But I'm delighted to have these four here. And who Anne's first? Okay, so do it, Anne.
Thank you very much, Donald and Claudia, and it really is a great pleasure to be here at this event, not only because it is my first time to Canada, so I'm very excited about that too. And yeah, it's really a privilege to be part of such a progressive and forward-looking discussion. I think Kasia alluded to it this morning, why it's important to highlight positive reforms, as in many parts of the world, governments continue to pursue very punitive, draconian, and disastrous policies with devastating consequences for human rights outcomes. And in many of these places, places where many colleagues of ours in the global network of IDPC work in Southeast Asia, in parts of Africa, there is no space, no room for reflection, for debate, or for acknowledgement of the failure of such approaches. And there is a continued pursuit of eradicating the drug market and a zero-tolerance approach towards drug use, which justifies harsh measures. And we know that these harsh measures fall most predominantly on some of the most marginalized and vulnerable people in our societies, many of whom are engaged in the illicit drug market or in drug use for other reasons, out of economic necessity, out of self-medicating for pain. And these are the people who are filling our prisons, compulsory drug detention centers. These are the people who are on death row or are being killed in extrajudicial killings, for example, in the Philippines, or they're farmers growing crops for subsistence and being subject to forced eradication when their livelihoods are taken away. So there are many policy harms related to the punitive prohibition model that has been universally pursued by most governments for decades. And in some respects, these approaches are so entrenched that it will take time to begin to unpick them. However, the evidence that demonstrates the failure of the criminalization of drug use as a deterrent is now too great to ignore. And I think that there are, several studies, an increasing number out there, that show that there is actually no correlation between how punitive a policy is towards drug users in particular and the prevalence of drug use in any given society. The only correlation that there is, where there is a punitive policy towards drug use in particular, is the level of harm that those people face is much more greatly exacerbated when they are criminalized. So their public health harms, their employment opportunities. We've mentioned briefly the HIV/AIDS epidemic amongst people who inject drugs, and it was interesting to hear how that's characterized as an epidemic that's in the past. In fact, between 2011 and 2015, the number of people the number of new HIV infections amongst people who inject drugs increased by 33%. So that epidemic still goes on. We talked about how criminalization drives people away from health services, drives stigma and discrimination, and there's growing evidence to show that contact with the criminal justice system increases people's propensity to reoffend rather than reducing it. So, sorry, I did have one slide, which I won't talk through, but it's our sort of infographic on how decriminalization works, what, why, and also the gold standard, which I'll just talk about in a minute. But the decriminalization of drug use, possession for personal use, and arguably cultivation for personal use, removing criminal sanctions for these behaviors, if you like, is a very important policy response, we think, that is in line with the public health response and can yield benefits and reduce policy harms. It's not a new approach. It's been around since the 1970s. Some countries, for example, Uruguay, actually never criminalized drug use, and we see around 40 plus jurisdictions globally that have implemented some form of decriminalization. There are varying approaches, and there are also some examples of bad implementation of decriminalization as well as positive examples of decriminalization, both of which we can learn from. In addition, at the global level, the global debate around not punishing people for using drugs is opening up. The last year, there was a UN General Assembly special session on drugs, the first kind of global summit on this in 18 years, and all the UN agencies that contributed to the debate called for the decriminalization of drug use, except for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. They tried to call for decriminalization, but unfortunately several governments basically asked them to withdraw their policy paper on this. 22 governments at the UN General Assembly also explicitly called for decriminalization. So I think we can continue to push these arguments at the global level that drug use must not be a criminal or punishable offense. And I have up there the gold standard of decriminalization, and this is something that, increasingly is being called for, to say, instead of decriminalizing and then instituting some sort of civil or administrative sanction, that no sanction be applied for people who are using drugs or possessing drugs for their personal use. And actually, those administrative and civil sanctions create a burden on the state and on law enforcement and have a negligible deterrent effect. So the Global Commission on Drug Policy recently called for this, and it's where the debate on decriminalization is moving towards. Another issue with decriminalization, perhaps though, and I've heard already this discussed coming up through the discussions we had earlier, is that it doesn't go far enough. And perhaps we need to look at how the full market can be managed through legal regulation. But I think that it's an important step on the continuum. It's kind of a harm reduction approach that we can take now. We can decriminalize the use and possession of all drugs now, not just cannabis, and not subject another generation of young people to the harms of criminal punishment around drug use. So my recommendation is that Canada really should consider this, should show leadership on this issue. What happens in a country like Canada will have repercussions elsewhere, and I think that it's important that for a government that's forward-looking, that cares about human rights, I think Canada should show leadership. And my final point is to say on the issue of safe injection rooms, we heard recently that the International Narcotics Control Board, who are always against the use of safe injection facilities, drug consumption rooms, just came out 2 months ago and said that they were permissible, that within a broader health framework that they were an important intervention. So also to support that debate within Canada as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, to invite our second speaker to the podium, Dr. Manuel Cardoso.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all. I'm proud and delighted you are invited Portugal to stay here and to present our policy. Thank you, Dan, for inviting me. I hope we can tell you what we do, and you can learn or, I don't know, do something related. It's the other side. Okay. In 1998, the Portuguese government invited a group of sages to prepare a report to change our policy, to prepare a new policy. In the late 90s, in all the 90s, we had some problems, like I hear here this afternoon. So this group present a proposition and a report, and the government make in 1999 a new strategy. This strategy is based on a balanced approach between supply reduction and demand reduction, and supported in two principles: humanism and pragmatism. Humanism because not matter what people do or consume or whatever. If he needs our care or concern, we have to give it to them. And the other, pragmatism, is thinking that we can do all in our power to help these people. Then an integrated approach. That's why I put it here, looking at treatment, social integration, harm reduction, prevention, and inside our decriminalization, and with decriminalization, dissuasion, and of course evaluating all the process. Decriminalization, this is the law. The consumption, the possession for own consumption of plant substances or preparations constitute an administrative offense and cannot exceed the quantity previewed for individuals for 10 days consumption. The drug addict is considered a sick person who needs health care. Dissuasion intervention provides opportunity for early intervention, and the dissuasion intervention is aimed to bring back to the system and to healthcare those who need this healthcare. But the use of drugs is still forbidden. So it's not a crime, they don't go to jail, but they are not, or people are not allowed to consume. That's why we create the commission on dissuasion that get people and help people to do something. These commissions have 3 members to decide what happened to these guys that is found by the police, appointed by the Ministry of Justice and Health. Remember that it's from 2000 and 2001, and this supported also for a multidisciplinary team with psychologists, social workers, physicians, and so. And the process is that if police found some guys consuming, they send them to this commission that in eye from public health, look at the risk of consumption, the kind of consumption, if the idea is to define or evaluate if this person is addict or only a consumer. If it is an addict, he goes to treatment. If he only consumes sporadically, he can make something or some other process like early interventions or something like that. Then this work of the Commission is related with this network. Health centers, treatment addicted center, employee and training services, police authorities, welfare services, prisons, and indicative preventions. We look at this always like a second point on the fluxogram of the process of treatment: prevention, dissuasion, harm reduction, and so treatment and reintegration. Okay, my last slide. It's our new national plan between 2013-2020. This is the structure of the plan. It's based on the same principle, or looking at the supply and demand field. Nowadays, we deal with all addictive behaviors and dependencies: drugs, new psychoactive substances, alcohol, gambling, medicines, and so. And the principle is the same. In the supply field, we have to look at the quality, the availability, accessibility, marketing, and so. For each substance oranges. On the demand field, it's important to see that in this national plan, the main principle is that we look at the individual, not at the substance. The most important is the person. And that's why we look at the life cycle. It's different to look at pregnant women, at childhood, adolescence, young adults, elderly. It's different. The context or the setting with people lives or stays, like family, schools, universities, workplace, or in the driving ways and prisons, that we have to look all these type of contests. People are different. The way to deal with is different. And then we identifying the types of intervention: prevention, general prevention, indicative prevention, or environmental prevention. Then treatment, harm reduction, dissuasion. We have to look to all this. One last point. We have two main important plans or projects. The first one, it's the response at that question of Rosalind, who said that we have to look at local. We have a global plan, but we need to look at small places. That's that plan. And the other one is the risk of consumption. It's small or big or dependence, and we need to look at the individual and give them the support that he needs, and we have to think at some levels of response. That's why our plan, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite Dr. Mark Ware to the podium.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Merci à tous et toutes. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation de présenter ici. C'est une production et une présentation très impressionnante. Donald, that means thanks very much. Thank you again. I'm a family physician, and I find myself a couple of times sitting listening today and asking, how did I get here? I'm surrounded by people who've thought a great deal more about drug policy reform than I ever have. And I suspect that the main reason why I'm here is because I was very fortunate to have spent 6 months last year as the vice chair of the task force on the legalization and regulation of cannabis in Canada, and during that journey I learned a great deal about not only what's involved in drug policy, but also how complex and how very finely tuned and nuanced this approach has to be. I came to this subject as a family physician working predominantly in chronic pain, and I think as much as we hear about the opioid epidemic, we also have to recognize that there's also a massive amount of chronic pain in our communities that's not being resolved, and these two issues about trying to get good pain management and resolving our issues with substance use are in some ways overlapping, and those of us working in the pain community struggle with this all the time and every day. But it was patients who came to me with their pain management stories reporting cannabis use that got me to thinking about why cannabis has the effects it does, whether there are therapeutic applications, and spent about 15, 16 years studying the subject. So it was with that perspective that I came into the task force, and we were very fortunate to have been supported by an incredible group of people at the government who formed a secretariat that supported us. We were very fortunate to have consulted widely with experts from around the world, some of whom are in this room, and who provided us with some of the recipes and the guideposts that helped us formulate our recommendations to the federal government. But what we effectively did was to hold a mirror up to Canadians and ask them, what is it that you want to see in a cannabis policy where cannabis is legal? And as you all know, the government had been given a mandate to legalize and regulate cannabis. So what was astonishing was that the predominant theme was not a question of whether this was a good idea or not. And we gave people lots of opportunities to reflect on whether this was a good thing. The overwhelming response from Canada was, we want to do this properly, and this is how we think it should be done. Don't forget about these issues. And we had a tremendous amount of input. There was probably what I think is the coolest email address ever, cannabis@canada.ca. Which is still open, by the way. As far as I know, it's still receiving input. If you just want to send a message to the people there, please do. But with up to 30,000 submissions received, and I think this is one of the highest responses in any policy initiative that had ever been put forward by the government. And then we also had over 300 organizational submissions from every aspect, I think, of society that you can imagine, from the addictions community, the pain community, from patients, from drug users, from an enormous array of different stakeholders. And I guess my takeaway message here is that in considering any form of drug policy reform, and I heard the message this morning, and this is what we did, was to listen to the people whose lives are going to be affected by this. Parents, youth, Aboriginal communities. We went from one end of the country to the other, north to south, and it was an amazing experience. We tried to consolidate this down and distill it into a series of themes. We made a report that had 80 recommendations to the federal government. It included things concerned with minimizing harm, so setting age. I mean, I cannot tell you how long we spent, and how many hours of discussion took place around whether there should be an age of access, at which point cannabis becomes okay to use. And I can only touch on the complexities of the subject. But just to suggest that these were some of the issues that we needed to address in terms of considering the concept of minimizing harms. In the middle, of course, was the supply and distribution question. Who's responsible for controlling the supply of cannabis, regulating it, distributing it, retailing it, and of course the differentiation between federal and provincial jurisdictions, as well as territorial and municipal, were also enormously important. And the recommendations around whether cannabis should be made available through the conventional liquor distribution channels, through liquor stores or not, and we made quite strong recommendations that not be the case. Important recommendations around personal cultivation, and this was again another topic of great interest, continues to stimulate discussion, that we recommended that there be capacity for people to allow to grow themselves cannabis up to 4 plants. We had discussions about the size of the plants and how big they were and the height of fences, a really remarkable series of considerations. Public safety, where people can use cannabis, how much they're allowed to possess, are they allowed to carry bales of it up to the cottage for the weekend, do they even need to do that? Issues about impaired driving, how do we regulate and measure impairment on the roads, the absence of effective impairment tests and body fluid testing was highlighted. And then at the other end of the minimizing harms, the potential maximizing benefits. Cannabis may have therapeutic value and does for some patients. So how do we encourage and continue to persist with a program that allows what we have at the moment, a program of medical access that can still be preserved, bearing in mind that the whole reason we have a medical cannabis program in Canada was because it needed to be carved out from the fact that cannabis was otherwise illegal. So what happens when you have a legal and regulated non-medical framework? Do you still need to have a medical access program if you can simply go down to a local retailer and purchase it? You do not need a physician to authorize that. And this became a very strong discussion, particularly among the patient groups who were very concerned that this would somehow delegitimize their idea of cannabis as a medicine. I was asked to sort of put up a few key thoughts, and based on this, I think what I'd suggest is that, I don't know if it's God or the devil that's in the details, or maybe both, but that the concept of federal, provincial, territorial, municipal engagement, I heard it mentioned this morning, this is what the government ends up putting forward in legislation, and if anyone asks me, I don't know the answer to when this is going to happen, but when it does, it's only the beginning of a process that has to roll out into provincial governments, and then I think ultimately, and again it was brought up just now, this is going to be an issue of the local municipalities, of our local communities, of our local schools. It's going to come down to the fine points of where we live that this is going to make its biggest impact. Multiple stakeholder perspectives, physicians, nurses, pharmacists on the medical side, law enforcement, schools, teachers. It's an unbelievably deep and tangled web that we weave. The policy needs to be dynamic. There's no one fit legislation that's going to be an answer to all of this. We needed it to be flexible. And in support of that, research and education needs to be provided. This is something that I'm still pushing for. I haven't yet felt that we have capacity to support this kind of legislative change in terms of measuring and understanding what the impact of this is on individual health and on public health. We need a lot more infrastructure. There are nests of very, very good researchers around the country. Canada excels in cannabinoid research, from plant sciences to pharmacology to clinical research to policy, but they're not well connected. We're not talking to one another, and I think for this policy to roll out and to be implemented effectively and to respond to the realities that we get when it's launched, we need that network to be in place and we need it to be responsive. the administration at the municipal level, at the provincial level, there's no question that for this to work, these institutions need to be adequately resourced and need to be able to support and provide the required elements for licensing, for regulating, for inspecting. This is a huge undertaking that's currently, I don't think we estimate just how deep this is going to go, and until the federal policy comes out, then the municipal and provincial governments will begin to look more carefully. And finally, I've heard this reflected again today, but the importance of the international community. I think Canada is and should be a leader in this regard. We deserve to be the country that takes the lead in this issue, that because of our position, because of our capacity, but we need to do this in harmonization with other countries, Portugal, Holland, Israel, South America, Mexico. They're all watching us. We're watching them. I think it really behooves us to work together on this file. So with that, I'm going to finish. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And I now invite our final speaker, Dr. Mark Kleiman.
Thank you very much. I'm giving in to peer pressure. It's against my religion to use PowerPoint, but I didn't want to stand out from the crowd. I want to talk first about the general problem of drug regulation, and then more specifically about cannabis. These remarks are radically different from the remarks I intended to make when I came this morning, largely a reaction to what I've heard so far. It seems to be necessary to say that legalization and regulation are not a panacea. There is not a solution to the drug problem that consists of getting the criminal law out of the way and turning it over to the doctors and the public health folks. And we have the example, right? We were told earlier today that alcohol users benefit compared to, say, heroin users by being able to get reliable supplies of stuff that isn't adulterated, and that's certainly true. As a result of which, in the United States, alcohol kills 3 times as many people as the opiates do. Some of them die of chronic disease. Actually, again, almost none of them die of acute poisoning from wood alcohol. That's the benefit of legalization. They die of the chronic effects of long-term drinking. They die of the acute effects of auto crashes. And they die of violence. Not all the people who die as a result of alcohol use were drinking. Something like half of the murders in the U.S. are committed by people who are drinking at the time, but so half of all the violent crime. That's not counting the crimes committed by people whose alcohol exposure was prenatal. We know that prenatal alcohol abuse has a very, very bad effect on people's life course, including criminal involvement. Studies in Canada actually suggested about 40% of the men in prison were damagingly exposed to alcohol in utero. So the notion that somehow legalizing all the drugs will get law enforcement out of the drug problem doesn't seem to be borne out. Tobacco, of course, the other great bad example, about 4 times as many deaths. None of them from acute poisoning, none of them from violence, all of them from the chronic effects of smoking, and from the existence of an industry that's dependent on dependent smokers. It's worth noting in the U.S. that none of the people who have proposed legalization as a harm reduction measure for the cannabis problem are in the trenches with those of us who are trying to get cannabis policy to follow harm reduction lines rather than commercialization lines. All of the movement in the U.S. is toward turning this loose on companies that will be in the business of selling cannabis. Availability does matter. As the opioid epidemic in the U.S. points out, there's nothing radically changed in the United States in 1992 that suddenly made people want to use opiates. What changed was the availability of prescription opiates and then the very vigorous marketing of OxyContin by Purdue Pharma. More money was spent on that than marketing that than any other drug in the history of the world. Several $billions was spent marketing. It had its effect. So the notion that supply doesn't matter, that we can ignore supply and just deal with social problems, seems to me pretty implausible. On the cannabis point, we're going to legalize because prohibition has failed. Unfortunately, the exaggeration of the risks of cannabis by some people who want to keep it illegal has led to a reaction of the people who want to make it legal saying that it's harmless. Well, it's not. Cannabis use disorder is a perfectly real thing. You can look at it in the surveys. About 4 million people in surveys in the U.S. say they're using more cannabis than they want to. They've tried to cut back and failed. That's not a trivial problem, and it's not going to be reduced by legalization. The notion that we should stop punishing users appeals to me overwhelmingly. I just point out, merely as a political matter, that if you say that in one breath and the next breath and say, and that's the first step toward complete legalization and commercialization, that's probably not the best way to sell that policy to the population. The basic fact that we're dealing with here, there's two basic facts we're dealing with here. One is psychoactive drugs are things that people lose control over. Not everybody, some people, but more than other commodities. So we shouldn't treat them as ordinary commodities because they have this particular kind of consumer risk that people find themselves unable to control their own behavior, or at least struggling to control their own behavior. And we need to, when we regulate drugs, need to take account of that. For most drugs, tobacco is different. For most drugs, a relatively small number of users consume most of the drugs, so they obey the Pareto 80-20 rule. 80% of the drugs are consumed by the heaviest 20% of consumers. That's true of alcohol in the U.S. It's also true of cannabis in the U.S. And the lesson of that is that if somebody's selling any of these drugs, could be a commercial enterprise or it could be the government of Ontario, their commercial interest, their interest in revenue, focuses them on the heavy users. Those are their good customers, right? So from what a public health point of view is the risk population, from a commercial point of view is the target demographic, the best customers. Expecting the nascent legal cannabis industry or the existing legal alcohol industry to worry about substance use is like expecting ExxonMobil to worry about global warming. That's the business they're in. And the risk of their gaining enough political power to prevent effective regulation seems to me ought to be ever present. No country in the world has effective alcohol regulation. Has alcohol regulation that would actually serve the interest of public health. It's not just a U.S. problem, and that's something we ought to worry about. So, on cannabis, we ought to worry about supply architecture, avoid commercialization as we can, and I include under commercialization putting the cannabis sales in the revenue department and telling them to make as much money as possible. We don't want anybody thinking about cannabis in terms of how much of this can I sell to make money. We need to think about pricing. We want to prevent pricing from going down. Right now, U.S. or Canada, it costs about $1.50 to get stoned. I don't see any reason for that number to go lower. We need to think about information, both in terms of restricting the marketing activity of this new industry, but also requiring appropriate information to be delivered at point of sale. One substantive recommendation I'd make, and this might apply to Canada right now, the retail clerks, the people selling cannabis across the counter, are selling a very complicated drug, much more complicated than alcoholic beverage. We need, therefore, better trained vendors. I want to claim that the retail clerks who sell cannabis ought to have pharmacology training. They ought to have substance abuse prevention training. They ought to have professional licenses. They ought to have a fiduciary responsibility to give advice in the interest of the customer, not in the interest of the store owner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Okay. We have some time for we're going to give the panelists a very easy question, and we hope it's going to be a provocative question. I know for some it might be. It might provoke something.
More easily provoked than others.
Okay, no, it's actually quite easy. And then we'll take a question from the audience, okay? Basically, what's your advice to Canada? And you have a, let's say a minute each to, I know some of you have no trouble following the minute.
Should I go first?
Yeah.
I don't know if this is on though. It's on? Okay. I think I already answered the question there in my presentation, but I'll say it again because I think it's worth saying again. I mean, I accept that decriminalization, is challenging to implement in a comprehensive way, and we heard from Manuel about the Portuguese example. It's a very involved model. There is a lot of investment in the health infrastructure that went alongside what Portugal did in terms of their decriminalization policy. I think that it is an important model to look at, although I still think that the idea of decriminalization without having a sanction at all is possible. It is, I was told at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs by the President of the International Narcotics Control Board, it is permissible under the UN treaties to implement such a model of decriminalization, and I think that it would have significant benefits in terms of allowing users to access healthcare services and reduce their stigma and discrimination. And in a country like Canada that's facing this overdose epidemic, I think that removing criminal sanctions towards people for using drugs is something that Canada needs to consider urgently and as a first step. I think legal regulation is even more complicated than decriminalization, and not to say that they both aren't, but I think that would be my advice, and then to scale up quickly the harm reduction response. In fact, that needs to happen now, but regardless of the legal change. Thanks.
I don't know what to say after this position. Yeah, Portugal is a small country with 10 million inhabitants in the West Europe. It's not like Canada. But in fact, when we decide to decriminalize, we had the United Nations against us from 4 or 5 years. That after 6 years they decide that it's not in the early report, that's not so bad, and nowadays they tell us that it's a good practice. So in fact it works, and it's really a comprehensive approach. What we thought at that time, it's that it's a paradox. Looking at a guy that consumes some kind of product, that it's a criminal, and then we help them to do that crime, to consume or to inject or anything. In Portugal at that time, people who go to treatment, they can't say his name. They invent the name, say something. And years later, they come for the professionals. I remember one case, inviting the doctor to his wedding with the wrong name. And the doctor says, I don't know this guy. Oh, I'm sorry, it's me. And he is in treatment for 10 years. So I think really it works. First, people can come to treatment or the approach to the health services without any problem, without any doubt, without any difficulty if you have give them access to treatment. And on the other side, on the supply or the police, our police took or look more to the big traffickants, the trafficking, They look at the big guys, not the poor ones that consume cigarette or anything else. So if I can advise, coming from a small country, decriminalize the process, all drugs.
And Mark, and Mark, who's just written a paper advising the government of Canada how to regulate cannabis, you can't read the paper.
I can't duck the question and say read the book. The quick answer is that I think Canadians need to learn how to say cannabinoid properly. This is a language that we all have to learn to speak. If you don't know what 420 is, if you don't know what dabbing is, this is a language that we have to learn to speak as a country, as parents, as families. But I think fundamentally at the bottom of that rather flippant response is the need for education. And I think Mark said it about educating the clerks at the retail outlet, that educating pharmacists, educating nurses, educating the population. There's so much crap written about cannabis from all perspectives, from the advocacy sides to the harm addiction side. The media is where most people get their information. There's a need for us to be really well informed and to understand what we know and what we don't. And to form really balanced judgments on a drug that's been stigmatized and prohibited for decades, where generations have forgotten that cannabis used to be a very useful and helpful plant on the planet. We've completely systematically forgotten that, and we're beginning to relearn it. And so this is a long, slow process. It's not going to happen quickly, but the more we can educate ourselves and each other on what we know, the better we'll be.
Raise alcohol taxes. Raise alcohol taxes. Raise alcohol taxes. Require people who commit crimes or put other people's lives at risk under the influence of alcohol to stop drinking using the 24/7 technique. Stop alcohol marketing. Pay attention to the risks of prenatal alcohol exposure. And that doesn't just mean discouraging drinking in pregnancy, because a lot of the dangerous drinking actually goes on before people are aware they're pregnant. But figure out appropriate therapeutic interventions. Perinatally, it looks like choline supplementation is helpful. But that ought to be major league research. On the illicit drug side, stop punishing users entirely. Completely agree with that. Refocus drug enforcement away from severe punishment for dealers, again, not very useful. Focus on discouraging violence within the illicit drug markets and breaking up dangerous and disorderly street markets. Don't rely on enforcement to shrink the drug supply. Now, it's different from legalizing. Right, but once you've prohibited a drug and done a little bit of enforcement, that's about all enforcement can do on the supply side. Now you're doing harm reduction enforcement to try to minimize the damage done by the illicit market. And I think that can go with radically shorter sentences for mere dealing. On the cannabis side, treat it like tobacco, not like alcohol. It should be explicit public policy to reduce the number of people who smoke a lot of pot, just as it's explicit public policy to reduce the number of people who smoke cigarettes. Doesn't mean punishing users, but it means designing a market for access for adults who want to use temperately while discouraging heavy use and access by minors. Try to develop a culture of temperate cannabis use, even use not to intoxication, as we now do with alcohol. It's striking how different cannabis is from alcohol in its typical use pattern. Most people who drink most of the time aren't intending to get drunk and don't get drunk. Be useful to spread that idea to the cannabis market. And finally, do a ton of basic research. We don't know which of the 400 chemicals in the cannabis plant has what psychological effect and how they interact with each other. So yeah, I want to teach the retail clerks to tell people what kind of cannabis to use, but at the moment we don't have the research base to give them that advice. So get the universities at work. Learn as much about cannabis as Pillsbury knows about brownie mix. Try 1,000 different preparations on 10,000 different consumers and ask them how it feels. And then we'll start to have the basis for giving serious advice.
Thank you. We have time for one question from the audience. I see an eager hand here. Dan?
Thank you so much. That was a riveting panel. Not to put you on the spot, but this is, a forum whereby we're thinking distantly in the future. So what would be the principles for regulating beyond drugs like cannabis that, even though we don't know everything about its composition and how the cannabinoids interact, we know vaguely about, that it isn't associated with a high range of harms. What about something like stimulants or heroin?
Well, let me just say, we don't know that cannabis is not associated with a high range of harms. We're reasonably confident that it's not going to turn out to be as bad as alcohol or cocaine or the opiates. But we don't have we don't experience of massive populations using massive amounts for many years. And I don't think we know the consequences. There's one very scary educational outcome study from the Netherlands that makes me worry about what the impact's going to be on scholastic performance. With respect to the other drugs, I am skeptical that we're going to develop legal processes of supply that succeed in keeping harm down to a dull roar. And therefore I expect 30 years from now that cocaine and the opiates and methamphetamine are going to remain illegal.
Does anyone else, any of the other speakers want to tackle that question? Please just jump in.
I think it's unfortunate that some of our colleagues who've been working on looking at regulation across all different substances aren't here. I'm talking specifically about Steve Rolls from Transform, who's written an excellent book, A Tomb, which is rather dull, but important reading, on looking at how other substances beyond cannabis might be regulated. And I think, earlier, it will depend from substance to substance what kind of regulation model would work depending on the level of harm, the propensity for addiction, etc. One thing I wanted to propose, and it sort of follows up this morning from the call to look at something like coca leaf, for example. Currently, coca leaf is under international control, basically considered, even in the UK, like Class A. But finding a way to allow milder stimulants onto the market, something like coca leaf, like packaged in a different way that's more accessible, which has a much, much lower level of harm than cocaine, but still has like a mild stimulant effect, would be one way to consider managing the stimulant market, for example. And, thinking more innovatively about stimulants and milder stimulants, I think, is a way to go in terms of trying to manage that more challenging market.
May I make a question? What's really the problem with the cannabis consumption in Canada related with the other consumption? Because our concern is not people who take drugs. Our concern is if that people who take drugs suffer because of that. And that's, on our point of view, that's the big problem. If nobody suffers, what's the problem? So I think that's the main issues. And And putting everything in the same bag, maybe it's not the right way to discuss these issues, because each one thinks and talk about different things. So I think it's important to look at this in that kind.